Native American slaves had it incredibly tough. And just to be clear, we're not here to sensationalize their struggles. We're here to shed some light on the harsh realities they had to face. Here we go. Number 20. Forced labor. Native American slaves endured strenuous physical labor, such as farming, mining, and various forms of manual work during the time when European colonists first came to North America. The dynamics of Native American slavery underwent significant changes with the arrival of Europeans. Instead of incorporating captives into their own societies as some had done previously, Native Americans started selling war prisoners to European colonists. In regions like Florida and the Southwest, the Spanish employed various legal mechanisms to enslave Native Americans, with the encomienda system being one of them. While the new laws of 1542 prohibited new encomiendas, existing ones continued, and the restriction imposed in 1542 was lifted in 1545. As the demand for labor grew in the West Indies due to sugarcane cultivation, European colonists began exporting enslaved Native Americans to the Sugar Islands. Historian Alan Gallay approximates that between 1670 and 1715, approximately 24,000 to 51,000 Native Americans were taken captive and exported through Carolina ports. Of these, more than half, roughly 15 to 30,000, originated from what was then Spanish Florida. Surprisingly, these numbers exceeded the count of Africans imported to the Carolinas during the same period. British settlers, particularly in the southern colonies, also engaged in the practice of acquiring or capturing Native Americans for forced labor in the cultivation of crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Although precise records of enslaved individuals are unavailable, it is clear that slavery in colonial America encompassed people who were considered foreign to English colonists, primarily Native Americans and Africans, both of whom were predominantly non-Christian. The Virginia General Assembly established certain terms of slavery in 1705. Number 19. Land dispossession. European colonization really did a number on Native Americans. They got kicked off their own lands, and some even ended up as slaves. When it comes to European colonialism in the Americas, textbooks usually point out a couple of key things. Africans were brutally forced into slavery, enduring a lot of pain and suffering in the New World. On the other hand, the Native American people are often shown as being hit hard by a lot of diseases, and the ones who survived ended up losing their land. Number 18. Cultural loss. Native American slaves often went through the heart-wrenching experience of being forcibly torn away from their families and communities, resulting in the painful loss of their cultural heritage and identity. During the tumultuous years of the Indian Wars in the 1870s and early 1880s, opinions varied back in the eastern part of the country. Some believed, as the story goes, that General Philip Sheridan, who was appointed in 1867 to deal with the Plains Indians, once quipped that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. However, there was a growing sentiment among American reformers who would later play a pivotal role in the Progressive Era. They began to critique the violence and argued that Native Americans should be guided towards Americanization to be integrated into American society. Key elements of this assimilation included individual land ownership, Christian worship, and education for children, marking the final phase of the campaign to reshape Indian life and culture. Starting in the 1880s, a coalition of clergymen, government officials, and social workers joined forces to facilitate the assimilation of Native Americans into American society. The government allowed these reformers to take Indian children from their homes and place them in boarding schools like the Carlisle Indian School or the Hampton Institute. At these institutions, they were educated to relinquish their tribal traditions and adopt the practices of American productivity, modesty, and sanctity through total immersion. These schools not only assimilated Indian boys and girls, but also provided vocational training for males and domestic science classes for females. Adult Native Americans were also a target for religious reformers, particularly evangelical Protestants and some Catholics, who aimed to persuade them to shed their language, clothing, and social customs in favor of a more Euro-American lifestyle. Number 17. Abuse and mistreatment. Slaves endured both physical and emotional abuse at the hands of their enslavers, enduring harsh treatment that included beatings, sexual exploitation, and various other forms of cruelty. Enslaved individuals were subjected to a range of brutal punishments, including whipping, shackling, hanging, beating, burning, mutilation, branding, rape, and imprisonment. These were often inflicted as a response to disobedience or perceived rule violations. Sometimes, the abuse served as a means for the enslaver or overseer to assert dominance over the enslaved person. Pregnancy did not shield enslaved women from punishment. Methods were devised to carry out lashings without harming the unborn child. Enslavers would dig a hole big enough for the pregnant woman's stomach to lie in, and then proceed with the lashings. Slave overseers were granted the authority to whip and punish the enslaved population. One overseer once told a visitor, "Some Negroes are determined never to let a white man whip them and will resist you when you attempt it. Of course, you must kill them in that case." A former slave even recalled witnessing women being whipped, noting, "They usually screamed and prayed, though a few never made a sound." It's crazy. Number 16. Inadequate shelter. Native American slaves often had to make do with inadequate housing, which meant they had to endure harsh living conditions and exposure to the elements. They were treated as if they didn't deserve proper bedding, adequate nutrition, enough sleep for the demanding workload, suitable shelter, or enough personal space to sleep comfortably. The artwork Frederick Schultz's The Slave Market, as well as Solomon Northrup's description of a slave market, vividly depict enslaved individuals being presented in a way to impress potential buyers. This gives the impression that owners viewed them more as showpieces than human beings. They would dress them up, instruct them to behave impeccably, and showcase their best qualities, whether it be their skills, endurance, or other attributes, all in an effort to fetch the highest price possible. However, if an offer was deemed too high, they would bluntly state that the price was too steep for a particular slave. Enslaved individuals faced a multitude of challenges and hardships, from being forcibly separated from their families to enduring substandard shelter and being subjected to relentless overwork without any form of reward. Number 15. Insufficient food. Slaves often had to make do with inadequate or subpar food rations, which sadly led to malnutrition and a range of health problems. In Native American communities, the practice of enslaving war captives was not uncommon. These captives were typically utilized for minor-scale labor, but there were cases where individuals would willingly put themselves into servitude through gambling, sometimes for a short duration and, in more extreme cases, for life. Captives were also subject to torture as part of religious rituals, occasionally involving ritual cannibalism. In times of famine, some Native American groups even resorted to temporarily selling their children in exchange for food. In a historical context, according to Diseases and Medical Disabilities of Enslaved Barbarians from the 17th century to around 1838, the physical and skeletal evidence provides a more objective perspective than historical records. It vividly illustrates the consequences of food shortages, with the skeletons from the Newton site showing signs of minimal and inadequate nutrition. There were periods of severe dietary deprivation, halting growth in some cases. Individuals on the brink of starvation endured substantial hardships, especially infants and small children who bore the brunt of diseases resulting from malnutrition. Number 14. Lack of freedom. Slaves had no legal rights or personal freedoms and lived under the complete control of their enslavers. Captives faced various fates, including lifelong enslavement, the possibility of being killed, or adoption. In some instances, captives would eventually be adopted, but only after a period of servitude. For instance, among the Iroquoian peoples, which included various tribes, the adoption process was guided by religious beliefs, and there were specific procedures and designated seasons when these adoptions could take place, aligning with the proper spiritual times. In many scenarios, new tribes adopted captives to replace warriors lost during raids. Warrior captives sometimes endured ritual mutilation or torture, which could even lead to death. These rituals were part of a spiritual grieving process for relatives who had been killed in battle. Adoptees were expected to step into the economic, military, and familial roles of the departed loved ones, essentially filling the societal void left by the deceased relative while maintaining the tribe's spiritual power. Number 13. Forced religious conversion. Many Native American slaves were compelled to embrace Christianity, frequently against their own wishes. As detailed in Krautheimer's work, Forced Conversion, A Global History, the coerced conversion of Native Americans was a widespread and systematic practice in the United States spanning the 16th to the 19th centuries. This was driven by a combination of religious and economic motives. European colonialists held the belief that Native Americans were considered heathens who needed conversion to Christianity for their salvation. Furthermore, they saw religious conversion as a means to assimilate Native Americans into European culture while gaining control over their land and resources. Similarly, as discussed in Boxer's Slavery and Conversion in the American Colonies, Native American slaves often found themselves pressured into adopting Christianity through various coercive means, including physical violence, threats of punishment, and promises of rewards. They were also compelled to attend Christian services and learn Christian doctrine. The forced conversion of Native American slaves was a traumatic ordeal with deep-seated effects on their culture and identity. Number 12. Disease. Slaves had little resistance to diseases brought by Europeans, rendering them highly vulnerable and resulting in elevated death rates. One study indicates that European settlers introduced novel viruses such as smallpox, measles, and mumps to North America. These outbreaks triggered significant population declines in Native American communities, shedding new light on the enduring impact of the transatlantic slave trade in North America. In the 16th century, numerous outbreaks in what is now Mexico claimed the lives of millions of indigenous people, Africans, and some Europeans. Yet the specific pathogens responsible for certain outbreaks remain unidentified, explains Axel Guzman Solis, the study's primary author. He was formerly associated with the International Laboratory for Human Genome Research at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, MECO, and is now pursuing a PhD at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York. He said, "Our aim was to uncover the viruses that circulated in Mexico during that era." Number 11. Inhumane Transport. Some Native American slaves had to endure really tough conditions when they were being moved to different places. In the early 17th century, things kicked off with the first recorded case of Native American slaves being shipped in 1619. They were brought to the English colony of Virginia on a Dutch ship. This whole deal caught on fast, and by the mid-17th century, thousands of Native American slaves were getting hauled to the colonies every year. These folks were jammed into cramped and unsanitary conditions, often chained up and forced to lay on the ship's grimy floor. Those ships weren't exactly luxury cruises. They were poorly ventilated, which meant the slaves had to deal with diseases, malnutrition, and dehydration. The journey could drag on for weeks or even months, and a lot of slaves didn't make it. In fact, one estimate suggests that up to half of all Native American slaves didn't survive the trip to their final destination. Number 10. Exploitation of indigenous knowledge. Enslavers took advantage of the traditional wisdom possessed by Native Americans to further their own interests. This involved coercing Native American slaves into sharing their knowledge about the land and its resources, which was subsequently employed to exploit the land for the benefit of the enslavers. For instance, Native American slaves were compelled to impart insights on optimal hunting and fishing locations, effective land cultivation techniques, and the medicinal properties of plants. The enslavers then utilized this knowledge to extract maximum wealth from the land, often without consideration for the environment or the welfare of the Native American slaves. A prevalent avenue through which Native American knowledge was exploited lay in the realm of agriculture. Most Native American slaves were pressured to educate their enslavers about the most effective methods for cultivating the land and identifying the most suitable crops to grow. This knowledge was then leveraged by the enslavers to establish expansive plantations geared towards producing crops for export. Number 9. Forced separation of families. Families frequently got torn apart where spouses, parents, and kids ended up being sold to different enslavers. Back in 1755, a bunch of more than 100 Native American slaves got shipped from Pennsylvania to Virginia on a boat named the Charming Nancy. As they made the journey, these slaves got separated from their families and, tragically, Many of them never got to see their loved ones again. Fast forward to 1838. The U.S. government made over 16,000 Cherokee people embark on a grueling trek of more than 1,000 miles from their homes in Georgia and Tennessee to what's now known as Oklahoma. Along this painful journey, families were often split up and, sadly, many lost their lives. This sorrowful episode in history became infamous as the Trail of Tears. In 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law not only made it illegal to aid escaped slaves, but also made it easier for slave owners to reclaim their escaped slaves, even if they had found refuge in free states. As a result, this law caused the forced separation of countless families, as slave owners could reclaim their enslaved loved ones even after they had enjoyed years of freedom. Number 8. Dehumanization. Most Native American slaves often faced the harsh reality of being regarded as mere possessions, stripped of their humanity and reduced to tools for labor. Steinbeck's novel The Pearl vividly illustrates multiple instances of dehumanization inflicted by white Americans upon the lives of Indian Americans. The story portrays how white colonialism led to the displacement of Indian culture and their assimilation into white American society. One striking example of this dehumanization can be observed in the actions of the doctor and the priest. The doctor's sole interest lies in the valuable pearl that Kino discovers, viewing Kino and Juana as nothing more than exploitable objects. Similarly, the priest exhibits a dismissive attitude toward Indian culture, urging Kino to be thankful for the whites' so-called civilizing influence. Another instance of dehumanization is evident in the suppression of Indian art by white Americans. The song sung by Kino is an integral part of his culture, yet it is callously labeled as primitive by the whites, underscoring their perception of Indian culture as inferior. Throughout the novel, Steinbeck skillfully portrays how white Americans dehumanize Indian Americans by treating them as subhuman, resulting in a deeply destructive form of racism and oppression that has left a devastating impact on Indian communities. Number 7. Loss of language. A lot of Native American slaves ended up losing their native languages because of forced assimilation. It's really sad, but losing their language was a major consequence of colonialism and slavery for Native American communities. Way back before Europeans came, there were tons of different Native American languages spoken all over North America. But with colonization came violence, sickness, and people being pushed off their land, which wiped out entire Native American populations and took their languages with them. On top of that, these slaves were often torn away from their families and communities, which made it tough for them to teach their language to their kids. Plus, slave owners actively discouraged or straight up banned Native Americans from speaking their languages because they saw it as a challenge to their authority. So, sadly, many Native American languages disappeared forever during the time of slavery. Number 6. Medical experimentation. Native American slaves were sometimes used as guinea pigs for medical experiments without their say-so. These tests were often really painful and risky, and sadly, many of them didn't make it out alive. This kind of medical testing on Native American slaves was sadly widespread and done on a large scale. They'd be put through all sorts of painful and risky experiments without ever giving their okay. One of the most notorious cases was the Carlisle Indian School experiment. This school put Native American kids through a bunch of medical experiments, like making them get vaccinations, trying out different diets, and even exposing them to diseases. And then there's the Tuskegee syphilis study, where the U.S. Public Health Service tracked the progress of syphilis in African American men without giving them any treatment, even after they had penicillin available. This whole practice of experimenting on Native American slaves was a terrible crime, and it caused major harm to the victims and their communities. Number 5. Resistance and punishment. Enslaved individuals who tried to break free from their enslavement risked facing some pretty harsh consequences, like getting a serious beating, being whipped, or in some cases, even losing their lives. On the National Museum of American History website, back in the day, those who were enslaved found all sorts of ways to fight back against their situation. They do things like slow down their work, mess with tools, or pretend they were sick. Sometimes they'd band together and stage revolts, like the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 or the Amistad Mutiny in 1839. And if these brave souls got caught trying to escape or helping others break free, they'd pay the price with some heavy punishment. Think more whipping, a good beating, or, worst case scenario, they'd end up 6 feet under. Some even got branded or maimed as a form of punishment. On the National Park Service website, the Underground Railroad was like the secret escape route for enslaved folks trying to make a run for freedom. It was risky and seriously challenging, but it was a major way they fought back against their enslavement. But here's the deal. If anyone got caught trying to hightail it out of there, they'd usually get a beatdown, and sometimes it'd be worse. Those who lent a hand to others looking to escape could also find themselves in hot water. On the Encyclopedia Virginia website, these guys resisted being enslaved in all sorts of ways, whether it was causing some mischief individually or getting together for a rebellion. Some were upfront about it, like running away, causing trouble, or rebelling. Others kept it on the down low, slowing down their work, pretending to be sick or messing with stuff. But for those who got caught resisting, it was no joke. We're talking about some heavy-duty punishment like whippings, beatings, torture, or even meeting their maker. Those who helped others escape didn't have it any easier. On the Library of Congress website, there was a pretty intense revolt led by Nat Turner that went down in Southampton County, Virginia back in 1831. Turner and his crew of enslaved individuals launched an attack on white folks, resulting in the death of 55 men, women, and children. Eventually, the Virginia militia crushed the rebellion, and Turner was captured and executed. Turner's rebellion was a big deal in the history of slave revolts in the U.S. It showed that enslaved people were willing to fight for their freedom, even if it meant risking it all. On the National Archives website, the Amistad Mutiny was a straight-up rebellion that happened on a Spanish slave ship in 1839. A group of enslaved Africans, led by Cinque, mutinied and took control of the ship. The ship eventually made its way to the United States, and the enslaved people had to stand trial. The Amistad Mutiny was a major turning point in the history of slavery in the United States. The courts decided that the enslaved folks were free, and they were eventually sent back to Africa. Number 4. Lack of legal protections. Native American slaves didn't have much in the way of legal backup, which made them easy targets for all sorts of mistreatment. There were several reasons behind this legal vulnerability. First off, Native Americans were often considered outsiders to the legal system. They weren't viewed as citizens of the United States, so they didn't get the same rights as the white folks. Second, even the few laws that did exist usually didn't cover Native American slaves. Take the 13th Amendment, for instance. It ended slavery, but it specifically left out Native Americans. Third, the courts weren't exactly enthusiastic about enforcing the limited laws that did protect Native American slaves. In many cases, the courts actually ruled that these folks were property, and their enslavers could pretty much do whatever they pleased with them. The outcome of this lack of legal protection? Native American slaves often endured unspeakable horrors. They were made to work long hours in brutal conditions, and they frequently suffered beatings, sexual assault, and even murder at the hands of those who enslaved them. They had zero access to the legal system and were completely at the mercy of their captors. This absence of legal safeguards for Native American slaves is a dark and regrettable part of American history. It's crucial that we remember and learn from it so that we can prevent such injustices from happening again. Here are some concrete examples that highlight the lack of legal protections for Native American slaves. 1. In 1832, the Supreme Court decided in the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia that Native Americans couldn't be seen as a foreign nation, which meant they couldn't take the United States government to federal court. 2. In 1838, the tragic Trail of Tears took place when the U.S. government forcibly removed over 16,000 Cherokee people from their land in Georgia and Tennessee to Oklahoma. Many lost their lives due to disease, exposure, and hunger during this forced march. 3. In 1861, the United States government passed the Indian Intercourse Act, which was supposed to stop the sale of alcohol to Native Americans. But this law was hardly enforced, leading to many Native Americans struggling with alcohol addiction. 4. In 1868, the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with several Plains Indian tribes. promising to protect their land and resources. However, the U.S. government later broke the treaty and began encroaching on Native American land. Number 3. Sexual abuse. Native American slaves often experienced sexual abuse from their masters and mistresses, which could leave them with lasting physical and emotional scars. Since the early days of contact, sexual violence played a significant role in the European conquest of America. Spanish conquistadors, for instance, sexually exploited indigenous women as part of their domination of native societies in Mexico and Peru. Even French and English colonists got in on this exploitation of native women, although they saw themselves as victims of Indian sexual abuse. Over in the English colonies, the household's central role in political organization gave men a lot of power over women and other dependents. This, unfortunately, kept sexual violence within the family and spousal abuse well hidden. While rape was technically against the law in the English colonies, it was rarely prosecuted, except among the Quakers in Pennsylvania. The widespread use of unfree labor also added to gendered violence in early America. Indentured servants often found themselves at the mercy of their masters, and enslaved African American women routinely suffered brutally in sexual assault as a means to produce more slaves. Things began to shift during the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, when colonial attitudes were changed. As the power of the household head weakened and marriages started being seen as loving relationships, issues like spousal abuse and rape were addressed and prosecuted more frequently. However, these changes typically applied to white women, as slavery continued to limit progress in this area. Number 2. Slave markets. Native American slaves were regularly traded in markets, further emphasizing their treatment as property. Massachusetts played a leading role in King Philip's War and the Pequot War. It's likely that Massachusetts had a larger number of Native American slaves than either Connecticut or Rhode Island. In 1676, John Hull, the treasurer of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, organized a public sale of at least 185 Native American captives from King Philip's War as slaves. Hull also shipped over 100 Native Americans to be sold in slave markets in Cadiz and Malaga. Number 1. Intergenerational trauma. The long-lasting effects of Native American slavery still play a big role in indigenous communities today, causing ongoing social and economic inequalities due to this historical injustice. Intergenerational trauma is when the emotional and psychological scars from trauma get passed down from one generation to the next. This can happen through direct exposure to trauma, seeing it happen, or being raised by someone who's been through traumatic experiences. Native American slaves endured terrible trauma like physical and emotional abuse, sexual violence, and being torn apart from their families and communities. This kind of pain can have a lasting impact on the descendants of Native American slaves, even generations down the line. Some common signs of intergenerational trauma in Native American descendants of slaves include: Number 1, keeping quiet or pretending the trauma didn't affect them. They might avoid discussing the suffering their ancestors went through or act like it didn't have any impact on them. Number 2, staying on high alert. They could be constantly on the lookout for danger, easily startled, or have trouble sleeping. Number 3, struggling with anger and frustration. They might find it hard to control their anger or express their emotions in a healthy way. Number 4, turning to substances. To numb the pain, some may use alcohol or drugs. Number 5, dealing with mental health issues. They may be more likely to face depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Intergenerational trauma can be incredibly tough for Native American descendants of slaves, affecting their relationships, their ability to succeed in life, and their overall well-being. Thanks for joining us today as we delved into the dark depths of history to shed light on the disturbing realities faced by Native American slaves. Remember, understanding the past is vital for creating a better future. By educating ourselves about the darker aspects of history, we can work towards a more inclusive and compassionate society. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.